Good afternoon, everyone. Just waiting for everyone to sign on, and we'll be getting underway for our TDSB Budget Town Hall momentarily. Thank you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon at our Budget Town Hall for the Toronto District School Board. Before we get underway, I'd like to start this afternoon's session with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Thank you. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. It really is important for us to have the opportunity to hear directly from you during this budget process. We're joined today by Associate Director Stacey Zucker and Executive Officer of Finance Craig Snyder. Stacey and Craig will begin today's town hall with a presentation that provides some high-level information about the budget process, as well as a snapshot of our current financial picture. During this time, you can ask questions and share feedback using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll be answering those questions following the presentation. After the presentation, we will take some time to answer as many of your questions as possible. We'll do our best to group common themes together so that we can get to as many as possible. And then just please note, we won't be able to address very school-specific questions here today. Those are best brought forward to your school principal. And if you miss any part of today's session, it will be recorded and posted on the TDSB's website for budget, should anyone wish to see these at a later date. With that out of the way and without further ado, let's get started. I'll throw it over to Associate Director Stacey Zucker. Stacey?
Thank you, Ryan. Sorry, and the first thing that I would like to talk to everyone about is just in general our requirements to balance the budget. So we are required under the Education Act to submit a balanced budget, and that budget is due to the ministry at the end of June. So under the regulation, the board can have up to a 1% deficit, and for us that would be about 28 million. But once a board has a deficit, the ministry gives them 3 years to address that budget deficit. And so last year, TDSB had a 1.4% budget. And so we were given 3 years to address the budget. And so 23-24 is the second year. So last year, or the year that we're currently in, we have a $40 million deficit. And the expectation is that we would have a $15 million deficit for next year, 23-24. And then in the following year, we would not be in a deficit any longer. That's the plan that we have submitted to the ministry. So that is the number, that 15.1 million that we are working towards in order to achieve the deficit that we have submitted to the ministry and that we have said that we are going to achieve. So just some background information for the rest of the presentation. So we receive most of our funding through the Grant for Student Needs, about 97%. The GSN is mostly dependent on enrollment. So we take our enrollment. There are some very specific benchmarks that are included in the grants. And for the most part, our enrollment times those benchmarks gives us the grants. So as you can imagine, as our enrollment increases, the grants go up. As our enrollment decreases, grants go down. And so that's why the projected enrollment is such an important part of estimating our grants for the following year. In addition, the ministry releases the grants in March or April, and that we use our estimated enrollment to do our projection for the following year. Our GSN is projected to be about 3.1 billion for 23-24. And so again, when we look at those estimates, it's really important for us to have, again, our enrollment in place, but then that also allows us to determine where our financial position is going to be for the next year based on our projected grants and then our projected expenditures. So high level, that $3.1 billion is made up of the grants that you see on your screen. So there are a number of components of the GSN. And I'll go through a couple of them just to give you a high level when we look at the major components of the GSN. The biggest one, the blue section there, the People Foundation allocation, that is where most of the funding for the classroom comes from with regards to resources, teachers, ECE supports in kindergarten classes, and technology, for example. Then we have in the gray our special education allocation. And again, that funding supports our students who receive special education supports. A significant component of this grant is based on overall enrollment. So not necessarily the number of students that receive support, but again, our enrollment as a whole for TDSB times an amount per enrollment. The dark gray allocation near the top is the school operations allocation. So that one relates to the costs that it takes to operate our schools. So utilities, maintenance, caretaking, anything that relates to the operation of the physical buildings of the school. The orange slice near the bottom, the school foundation allocation, that would be where the administration for schools is funded. So that would be our principals, vice principals, and our school office. The only other large slice that I just want to mention, because we were looking at all of those around 10%, would be the teacher qualification allocation. And basically, again, the People Foundation grant gives us our funding for teachers based on average salary. The qualification allocation takes the actual salaries of the staff that we have working for TDSB. So if they have more experience, then their salaries are higher, and therefore the ministry gives us a grant to be able to allow us to pay for those additional costs related to the actual salaries. So again, this is about 97% of our total funding, and it's about 3.1 billion. When we look at the grant for student needs, year over year, it's pretty similar. So what we look at when we talk about how it 23-24 is we're looking at how it's changed from the current year to next year. So we did receive the grant on April 17th, and after review, some of the key changes included a new transportation funding model. So again, the funding for transportation has not changed across the province, but the province did look at the funding model and ensure that it was being adequately allocated to all boards. And so based on that, some boards went up in their funding and some boards went down. And TDSB was fortunate to receive additional funding in transportation. So just for everybody's information, 23-24 will be the first year in a while where we have enough funding in transportation to adequately support our transportation costs. Similarly, Indigenous education funding also had a realignment. And again, TDSB did receive more funding than they have previously. Many of the components of the Indigenous education grant, we do spend specifically on Indigenous education. So as the funding goes up, we will also see expenditures related to Indigenous education increasing. We've received funding for remote learning administration, so to support those virtual schools. We receive funding to help with the principal and the office support. The next couple, I think, are important for us to understand. When we hear an announcement about the GSN and the news releases that are part of the release, a lot of times they talk about, how much additional funding has been added to the grant. And it's accurate. We have received more money than we have in previous years. However, a lot of the funding that is included in that increase is already spoken for. And so labor related changes is one of those examples. So the ministry does the collective agreements with most of our unionized staff, or all of our unionized staff. And so when they negotiate an increase in salaries, then they also fund us for that increase in salaries. So although we see a significant increase related to salaries to support, it directly supports the actual increase in costs. So there is no assistance in helping us to balance the budget by that increase in funding. In the same way, some grants that we receive, so again, the GSN is about 97%. Another component are our priorities and partnership funding. And some of those grants they are grants that we also receive from the ministry, and they are offered on an annual basis. So year to year, the ministry will announce the grants and they will tell us how we need to spend them. 3 of those grants in particular in 23-24 that have always been one-time grants have been moved into the GSN. So good news, that means that there's more of a likelihood that they will be permanently funded, but it is not new money for TDSB. It's just a change in funding source. So we already were receiving that grant temporarily. Now we're receiving it permanently, but it doesn't change the fact that there are still expenditures attached to it, and therefore an announcement of an increase in GSN does not again allow us to help us to balance our budget. The last thing that we wanted to highlight is that the non-staff benchmarks for school operations, so things like utilities, have increased by 2%. And we all know through our everyday costs that 2% doesn't necessarily help us to deal with the cost of inflation. And we do know that in some of our utilities contracts, the increase will be about 6.5%. So although it does help us, it still doesn't close that gap. And in fact, the gap widens because our costs are going up more than the funding is going up. So those are some of the highlights that we wanted to provide for you related to the GSN. The last part, and I think that this is an important piece, and this is probably where if students and parents and staff are seeing an impact at their schools in staffing, that is almost for sure as a result of the discontinuation of the COVID Learning Recovery Fund. So in 2021-22, the ministry provided temporary funding to support learning recovery. And then they continued that funding for another year. So it was originally only intended for 1 year. They continued it for another year, but that funding has been discontinued for 23-24. So it was always clearly identified as one-time funding. And so now that the funding is discontinued, there are, for TDSB, it was $31.5 million. So a significant amount of money that we were able to add positions in for those 2 years, 522 positions. But because that funding is no longer going to be continued, then the positions attached to that funding would also not be part of the 23-24 budget. And so the only exception would be that TDSB, the board did approve keeping 40 of the school-based safety monitors that were included in the 522 positions, but that did add $2.3 million to the budget. So you can imagine if the board were to decide to keep all of these 522 positions, then it would add $31 million to the budget. So the next slide just shows you a list of all of those positions. And aside from the bottom 3, which obviously still provide support to students, those are school-based staffing, meaning that they are directly in school. So when I mentioned that if you're seeing a reduction in staffing, it is likely due to this COVID Learning Recovery Fund. This is why, because those 522 positions were mostly put into schools to support students through that learning recovery time. So the next source of funding, and again about 2%, are our priorities and partnership funding. It is supplemental to the GSN. So again, it's usually provided for one time to support specific initiatives, and the ministry announces these annually. In addition, the ministry usually tells the board how we need to spend that money. They'll say this needs to be spent on professional development, and they tell us the maximums that we can spend on administration and that sort of thing. So we do need those agreements in order to fully be able to allocate this funding. But to highlight some of the key changes, and these changes are good news for TDSB. The first one is really a re-announcement of funding. So in previous years, the board had $4.5 million in math strategy PPF. So we received $4.5 million to support math strategy. That's been discontinued for next year. However, approximately the same amount is being included or provided for the math recovery plan. So once we get the agreement, and based on our understanding of what will be included in there, it may change the types of supports. The intention is to provide more direct support to students, but it is supporting math in the same amount that math was being supported in previous years. The next one, again, the ministry did discontinue one of our grants that supported evidence-based reading, but they did add $9 million more to support early reading and reading intervention. And again, our understanding is that this will be providing direct support to students. So the reading intervention teachers that we have in place will be able to support students, work with students one-on-one or in small groups directly. In addition, there's new funding of $11 million to support de-streaming and transitions to high school. And so again, this would mostly be staffing. It would be types of staffing to support in grade 7 and 8 to support that transition piece. So like guidance, for example. And then we would also have staff in secondary schools in grade 9 and 10 to support de-streaming. So in all of these examples, we are still waiting for more detail to fully understand the requirements for the spending. And in some cases, we already did have the types of staff that we are being provided funding for. So we will continue with those staff, obviously, and we will be able to fund them through these PPFs. So it may free up some budget or some dollars in order to help us balancing our budget. The last area of revenue that we receive, and again, we've received most of it from the ministry, but the last component really relates to our other revenue. It includes things like permits and leases, interest revenue, and international student fees. And the thing that I wanted to point out here is that during COVID, because of some of the restrictions that were in place, whether it was that we couldn't lease out our spaces to community use of schools, or travel restrictions impacted the number of international students that we had. The revenue decreased during COVID, but we have seen it start to increase, and we expect it to reach pre-pandemic levels shortly. So that is good news to help us, again, to support the expenditures of the board. So that does lead us into expenditures. What I want us to get from this is where we spend our money, and really how much of it is truly discretionary without an impact. And I would say that if you are somebody who's been with TDSB for a long time, you'll know that we have been operating with a structural deficit. So when we look to help to balance the budget, we really look to our discretionary expenditures to try to minimize the impact on students. And so after doing that for a number of years, it gets harder and harder to make reductions without an impact on programming. So obviously we are trying to minimize the impact, but it does get harder. And part of the reason that you'll see is that of our budget, instructional expenses or expenditures equal about 81% of our budget. And again, it's about $3.3 billion in spending. Our building operations and maintenance, so that would be the operating of our schools, again, caretaking, utilities, maintenance, is about 13%. Transportation, so providing busing for students, is about 2%. Administration, school administration and central administration is about 2%. And that really only leaves about 2% in other, and even those other, there are still things that we do need to obviously have in order to be able to operate our schools effectively and to provide programming to students. So this just shows our expenditures another way. As you see, our salaries and wages are about 73% of the total budget, and then benefits are another 14%. So salaries and benefits, or our costs for our staffing, are 87% of the total budget. Supplies and services, so that would be all the supplies and resources that we have for the classroom, all of our technology, that sort of thing, would be about 7%. Fees and contractual services, so that would include transportation, any major contracts that we have. It would include things like our Wi-Fi provision and any contracts that we have for utilities. And so when you get down to it, we really only have about 1% of our total expenditures that would be in that sort of other category. And again, I think this just shows you that in order for us to balance the budget that we do, when 87% of your budget is salaries and wages, it is hard to do that without an impact on staffing. There are a number of budget challenges for 23-24. And we've highlighted a few of them because we think, again, it's important to understand. One of them is an increase in statutory benefits. So our statutory benefits, which include CPP, EI, those have increased over the last 5 years by a fairly significant amount. And so you'll notice that on your own paycheck, we are paying more for CPP. The employer portion is the same. And so TDSB over the last 5 years has paid about 29 million more in CPP. Yet we've received zero increase in revenue. So that means obviously that's a cost that we have no control over. That's a cost that we have to pay. And yet we haven't received any increased funding, which means that obviously in order for us to submit a balanced budget, we are having to look to other areas of the budget to help us there. In addition, we've seen an increase in replacement costs related to sick leave. And we've noticed this across the province as well. And so there's a lot of advocacy and understanding that this is a cost that boards are incurring. But we have not seen an increase in revenue to help us with those costs. As I mentioned, related to our utilities that are at 6.5%, but we're only getting a 2% increase in funding. That's not unusual. And again, we all see it when we buy groceries and anything else, that inflation has caused different prices to increase. And yet we haven't seen that corresponding increase in funding. So again, in order to help us balance, then there will be things that we will have to do to offset that increase in spending. We did increase our school safety related, mostly staffing in 22-23. So in the current year in January, we did increase our staffing in order to support school safety, and we will be maintaining that increase in 23-24. And then we also do spend more than we receive funding for in a number of areas. Some of the examples include special education. We spend about 67 million more than we're funded for. Lunchroom supervision, we spend about 12 million more than we're funded for. Student nutrition, about 1.2 million, and outdoor education, about 2 million. And that's just to name a few of them. When we look at safety, which is mentioned above, we spend approximately 26 million more than we're funded for. So in order to support all of these things, which obviously are very important, again, that does impact our financial position and it creates pressures on our budget. This chart just outlines a little bit more information related to our sick leave and our statutory benefit increases over the last 5 years. that have not seen a corresponding increase in funding. So over the last 5 years, we've seen an increase in these types of expenses of 47.3 million with no corresponding increase in funding. So that leads us to our current financial position. In February, we did present a report to the board's Finance, Budget, and Enrollment Committee that showed a projected deficit of 61 million. As I mentioned earlier, when the school-based staffing was approved, we added $2.3 million to maintain the 40 school-based safety monitors. And when the GSN was released, again, when we hear the release, we hear, oh, boards are getting so much more money. But when we look at all of the expenses that are related to those increases, our financial position actually only changed by 1.6 million. So the starting position for our 23-24 projected deficit is 61.7 million. School-based staffing makes up about 68% of the board's total budget. And so we also bring school-based staffing to board in March for approval in order to allow the schools to prepare their staffing allocations for next year. So they find out the number of teachers that they're getting, the types of supports that they're getting, in order for them to be able to plan their classes and to set up their schools for the following year. So that's why that's done earlier in the year than the remainder of the budget. And so in March, there were $9.4 million of reductions that were in addition to the COVID positions that we talked about previously. So that $31.5 million, the funding was gone, so the positions aren't included, but then there were also $9.4 million. And $9.4 million sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money. And I think it's important to also put it into a little bit of context. $9.4 million is about 0.4% of our total school-based staffing allocation. So again, we know that some of these reductions may impact your school specifically, but in the most of those reductions that we are seeing in the impacts on schools are really as a result of that COVID learning recovery funding. Through COVID learning recovery in 21-22, so 2 years ago, the board did add 38.5 vice principals, and they were reduced as part of that COVID learning recovery fund not being continued. However, the board did add back 8 secondary vice principals and 20 elementary vice principals during the last board meeting. So 18 of those positions are going to be funded by one-time funding that's been carried forward from previous years, but 10 of them will add another $1.4 million to the budget. So school-based staffing, the original decrease was 9.4 million. If we add back the 1.4, we're at a decrease of 8 million. And again, that's about 0.4% of our total staffing allocation for schools. So we started at the $61.7 million projected deficit. There were reductions of 8 million related to school-based staffing. So our updated projected deficit and what's been approved by trustees to date puts us at a $53.7 million deficit. And if you recall from the beginning of the presentation, we have a commitment through our deficit recovery plan to get to a deficit of 15.1 million. So that requires further reductions of 38.6 million in order to achieve that $15 million. And so the next thing I want to talk about to get to that $38.6 million are the budget drivers. And this is really, really important. In March, the board approved our strategic budget drivers that develop help to guide the development of the budget. And those top 6, based on public consultation, and I'm going to read them out again because I think it's really important that to understand what was considered in making some of these recommendations. Staff allocation to support students, student and staff safety, mental health and well-being, student success and engagement, equitable access to learning opportunities, including Indigenous education, human rights, modernization and accessibility. So those are the top 6 that were, again, based on public consultation. And so what is important to know is that staff have taken those into account when proposing the options to balance. And so it's not necessarily just what did we reduce, it's what didn't we reduce, because we do know that in order to get to 38 million or to 15 million, that we are going to have to make reductions and that we are spending more than we receive in funding. So our requirement to pass a balanced budget means that we have to make difficult choices. But we really did use these drivers to help us to make those choices. And again, not necessarily just what you're going to see in the options to balance, but what you're not going to see. So again, we have to get to 15 million. So these are the options that have been proposed to trustees. So they've been presented, and but they have not been passed yet. And this is really where there's a opportunity to provide feedback related to these options. And so I'm going to go through them, and then we'll conclude our presentation and give a chance for questions. But the first one, and it's not really necessarily an option to balance, I think I'm starting off with the good news, is that we do receive, as part of our special education allocation, something called the special incidents portion, or SIP. And school boards apply for SIP funding on behalf of students who require more than 2 full-time board paid staff to provide intensive support for the health and or safety of the student, other students or staff. So we have a number of students in the board that do require at least 2 staff in order to be able to support those students. The deadline to apply for that funding is usually in December. And the important thing is that the supports already have to be in place. So it's not that we apply for the funding and then we put the supports in place. We have the supports in place to support the student, and then we submit a claim to be able to be reimbursed up to, I think it's $28,804 per claim. So again, that obviously doesn't support 2 staff members, but it does assist us in being able to provide that support. So our claims that we have submitted have totaled about $5 million. And upon review, we've noticed that there are more claims that should be submitted. And therefore, we asked the ministry for an extension to be able to submit more claims. And they have agreed to this extension. So that's good news for the board. And we do estimate an additional funding of approximately $5 million. And so again, this isn't necessarily an option to balance. This will help us balance, and it will add about $5 million to the budget. So that's good news. The second proposal for an option to balance is a reduction in central teaching staff and centrally assigned principals. So we are looking at reducing 44 central teachers, and they are listed there. But when you see early reading coaches and K-12 coaches there, we also have to think about the PPFs that we're receiving and the funding that we are getting to provide direct support to students. So not that these two are offsetting, and it's just that it's a different level of support. But again, in trying to minimize our impact on students, we believe that this would be one of the ways that we can reduce our costs without a significant impact on students, especially because of the other supports that will be put in place or are in place. The 44 represent 11 per learning center. And again, For those of you who don't know, we have 4 learning centers in the board, somewhat geographically aligned, and those the 44 represent 11 per learning center. The reduction in centrally assigned principals represents a decrease of 1 per learning center and also 1 in the director's office, for a total proposed reduction of 5.6 million. The next option to balance, and again, if we go back to the very beginning, when we look at how much discretionary funding that we actually have, it's pretty small. But when we asked people to submit their budgets, we did ask our central budgets to reduce their spending by 5%. We did leave it up to the departments as to where the reductions could be made, but examples include the purchase of supplies or technology, a reduction in professional development spending, that sort of thing. And in addition, we're also reviewing all of our licensing agreements to determine if any of them can be paused or discontinued. So we're in the process of going through that exercise, but we believe that there would be projected savings of about 1.7 million for both of those exercises. The next option is our general interest courses. So the board does offer general interest courses to adults and seniors, and we've provided some examples here, but there are many of them, and they are at a very reduced cost, especially in comparison to other organizations across the city. But some of the examples include any kind of sort of food making, like pizza or salad, dance classes, art classes, calligraphy, those types of general interest courses. Right now, we are spending about $600,000 more than we are bringing in revenue. So we're losing about $600,000 a year on our general interest courses. Our policy requires that we break even. So right now we're reviewing ways to get back to a break even. And I know during COVID, it was important for us to be able to continue to offer these courses, whether it be virtually or in person. I think that's where that sort of 600,000 grew to that number. But we are reviewing to ensure that we're following our policy. And it would include possible fee increases, looking at things like enrollment thresholds where you would have to reach a certain enrollment for the course to be offered. So that would again add about $600,000 to the budget. In addition, as I mentioned, we receive other funding outside of the GSN, or some of our GSN allocations that we get need to be spent in certain areas. And so some of those grants were not spent during COVID due to restrictions that were in place. For example, we didn't do as much professional development during COVID because we weren't able to release the teachers to gather together. So we do have some funding, and we are looking at how we ensure that we're using all of that funding in order to help us to balance. We are also reviewing all of our grants to make sure that eligible expenses are included in that funding, so to make sure that everything that could be included in those PPFs is being included in them. And we are also ensuring that all programs are operating as efficiently as possible. And an example of that would be right now we spend more on continuing education than we are funded for. So we want to just make sure that our continuing education classes are full, and that the sites that they're operating in are spending our dollars efficiently. So we do estimate that based on the work that's included on this slide, that we would be able to add about $4.6 million back to help us balance the budget. The next option, and first I'm going to explain a little bit about our one-to-one device deployment. So we're currently in the second year of the program, meaning that we started with our grade 5s and grade 9 students in providing devices. So currently our grade 5, 6s, 9s, and 10s have devices. We also purchased the devices in the summer for the year following. So our year end is August 31st. That means that if we purchase before August 31st, it comes out of the school year or the budget of the prior year. So included in our current year budget is $9 million to purchase devices for September. So this option to balance does not impact the 23-24 device deployment. That means that any student entering grade 5 or grade 9 in September will be eligible to receive a device, and we will be purchasing those devices over the summer. But what we are proposing is a pause in the one-to-one device deployment for next year, meaning that we will not purchase the devices in the summer of next year for the following year. So for September 2024, those students entering grade 5 or grade 9, we would pause that deployment. But what that does is allows us to look at the 24-25 budget and to consider adding this allocation back in 24-25. And so we would purchase the devices, they would get delivered in September. So if they come in September, they're the next year's budget. And then we would have a fall deployment, which would be a little bit later than other students in the last couple of years have received their devices, but it would still allow us to continue the practice of providing those devices. So this would just be a pause and a little bit of a delay in the purchasing is what the proposal is. The next option is that we know that TDSB is providing remote learning. We will continue to provide virtual schools in 23-24 or remote learning. The ministry did allow us to either do it on our own, to work with other boards, or to take the enrollment from other boards. So that is what we have been approached to do. We've been approached by a neighboring board to provide remote learning for their secondary students. And so we are working with that board, and we would expect an increase in revenue of approximately $300,000. The last option, and it's somewhat unusual, I will say, and I think it needs a little bit of context, is that TDSB has more spaces, so more schools and spaces in schools than we have students. And because of the moratorium that's been in place, we have not been able to do any of our pupil accommodation reviews, and we have not been able to close schools. And again, closing schools is never something that's easy to do, but there are reasons to be able to look at closing schools to help us. One of them being it does impact our operating budget for the operation of those schools. And, you know, if you had 2 houses and you could all live in one, really to have the expense of having those 2 homes doesn't make sense. And especially if your salary hasn't changed. So what I'm saying is that our budget is based on enrollment, not necessarily on square footage for the most part. And that means that as our enrollment decreases, but we still have the same square footage to clean, to maintain, to heat, lights, that the costs haven't decreased significantly. So we have estimated the cost of operating schools that we are not able to close because of the moratorium by to about $12 million. And therefore, we are going to ask the ministry to be able to use $12 million of our proceeds of disposition to help us to balance our operating budget. It would be highly unusual. Proceeds of disposition is the money that we get when we sell properties. Somebody equated this to selling the furniture to pay the rent. And so it is not a permanent solution to balancing our budget. But again, when we cannot deal with our excess capacity, so when we cannot close schools and we are still incurring those costs, we do think that it's a reasonable request to use our proceeds of disposition to help us balance the budget. So if we look at all of those options, they total $38.8 million. And again, we were at 53.7. The options proposed by staff to trustees are 38.8 million. So that does bring us to the $50 million that we have committed to in our deficit recovery plan. So that's where we are right now. And just from a budget timeline perspective and where you have opportunity to provide feedback related to these options, obviously we have this town hall, we have another one this evening. We've had ward forums throughout the week. On June 12th, there will be an option to receive delegations from the public. So there's been a meeting set aside to receive delegations. On June 13th, staff will be providing a report based on the feedback that we've received at these different events to be able for trustees to hear and to discuss. On June 20th, we will be looking at bringing the operating and the capital budget to the Finance, Budget and Enrollment Committee for recommendation to the board. And on June 22nd, the board would approve the budget. And the budget is again due to the ministry on June 30th. So in the next 2 weeks, we would be looking at, again, finalizing a budget that we have committed to with a $15 million deficit. So I know that was a lot of information. I really appreciate everybody's time, and I'm going to turn it back over to Ryan to facilitate any questions that we may be able to answer.
Thank you so much for that, Stacey. And we are going to get to your questions. As I said, we're going to get to as many as we can. If you do have a question, you can just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and ask away. So without further ado, we will move on. Can we have a list of positions, cuts, and schools affected? Schools have been quiet about this, and we need to be informed. I think, Stacey, that it's difficult right now to be able to provide that school level data, just given the fact that some is COVID-19 funding, some positions have been added back. There are different positions from different pots of money. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, Ryan, thank you. And that is, and I would say that your schools are aware of the positions that they will have for next year. So they will have been able to do a comparison between the positions that they had and what they will receive. Again, sometimes it's based on enrollment. If enrollment has gone up or down, then you may see an increase or decrease in staff, which would have nothing to do with budget reductions or additions. But that should be able to be provided at the school level. And we have not sort of listed out all of the individual schools that have been impacted.
Perfect. Okay, thank you for that. Next up, could you please explain why or how a vice principal can be removed from an elementary school? My understanding is there's a process that looks at enrollment along with a number of different factors as far as who gets a VP and who may not.
Thanks, Ryan. So we all recognize the importance of vice principals in schools, and not that this is going to help, but what I will say is that the vice principals, the 38.5 that were added 2 years ago, obviously didn't exist 3 years ago. And 3 years ago, our enrollment in TDSB was higher than it currently is. So with the addition of the 28 vice principals back to the budget, TDSB does actually have more vice principals than it had in 3 years ago, and less staff. Like I say, that doesn't necessarily help for those schools that are not going to be receiving the temporary vice principal that they had received. And as Ryan indicated, there are a number of factors that were considered when allocating the vice principals, including, as you said, enrollment, but also looking at the types of needs at the school, the safety issues, how to ensure that whether or not there have been additional positions that have been lost in the school. So there is a report that did go to our Finance, Budget and Enrollment Committee that did actually provide the list of reasons or the guiding principles to help us to determine where the vice principals would be allocated.
Okay, thank you for that. Next up, how do schools access math recovery plan and early reading intervention funding? What is the criteria? Is that, I believe that's handled centrally as far as looking at the, again, enrollment and other factors that would look at how that may be allocated. And then I think part of that is the learning center model as well.
Yeah, so the superintendents will centrally look at in some of the instances how they are going to be allocated. And for math specifically, the ministry is actually telling us what schools that those supports should be in place in. And so we have not received that information yet from the ministry. They've just told us that they will be providing that information. So once we receive that list, then we will be able to start allocating those resources accordingly.
Thank you. Next up, how many salaries are centrally assigned positions that do not work directly with students? An example, a number of centralized principals, teachers in positions that do not work directly in school. I don't know if you have an idea of the percentage of salaries that are centrally assigned, and has this increased in the past 3 years? Well, I think, and this was asked a little while ago, so I think you did speak to that in one of your slides, as far as there are a number of central positions that are actually being reduced. While we have added, for example, school-based safety monitors on the safety side, Stacey, if I'm not mistaken, there are central principal positions. There are some coaches that are moving back to the school. So central staffing has been reduced over previous years. Is that fair to say?
Thank you, and I believe so, but I'm going to ask Executive Officer Snyder if he has any of the actual numbers available.
So thank you. And the approximately about 19% of our salaries and benefits go to meet our facilities, our administration, and other central staff. And they've been held constant or decreased over the last couple of years as we face financial challenges.
Okay, thank you for that. Next up, can you describe the process by which the ministry determines the GSN and PPF? Is there any collaboration with the TDSB, or is it simply presented to the TDSB, essentially dictated to the TDSB? Is this process codified in a specific law or charter? Again, I think I'll defer to you, but I think it has a lot to do with enrollment and that throughout the year.
Yeah, and thanks, Ryan. So the funding model was changed a number of years ago in order to equitably fund education across the province. So it is formula driven for the most part. There is opportunity before the GSN comes out where they do consult not only with boards, but also with the public and with our trustees. So based on that feedback, they use that to determine the GSN. But once the GSN is really, or once that initial feedback is provided, there's no back and forth between any of the boards in the ministry. The number is what it is, and then our enrollment determines how much we receive based on those benchmarks.
Okay, thank you. Next up, what type of roles constitute the increased safety spending? Educational assistants or something else? I think it's school-based safety monitors largely, but are there other positions as part of that? I'll throw it over. Craig, did you want to speak to that?
Yes, thank you. So there were several types. School-based safety monitors were the majority. There were some increases in social workers, youth and child counselors, and youth and child workers as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Question about SIP funding. This is the special education funding that we receive from the ministry. About the funding applications, does this include students in ISP classes like behavioral and ASD classes? Do we have that level of detail?
I don't have the level of detail, but it would include all of our students that receive support from 2 or more adults. So if that is required, that is the type of application that we would put in. So we would use all the data of all of our sites and classes that support special education students, and the ratios of staff to students that we have in those classes. That will help us to determine the eligible claims.
Okay, there's a question about central teaching. As far as more about this, I think Stacey has addressed that as part of an earlier question. A question about, is there cuts to professional support services staff coming? I specifically speech language pathologists and social workers. I'd have to defer to my colleagues. I don't believe so, but I don't know if that was linked to some of that COVID-19 learning recovery funding.
So again, going back to the budget drivers and where we didn't make reductions, aside from COVID learning recovery funds, we have not made any reductions in any of that staff. But COVID learning recovery did include child and youth counselors, child and youth workers, and social workers.
Okay, thank you for that. Under POD, or proceeds of disposition, which schools would be closed, and has there been a projection made for future student growth based on residential development, for example? And this person highlights that, yes, there are some schools severely overcrowded. How do you close schools when there are severely overcrowded ones? I'll defer to you on this, but right now there is a moratorium by the Provincial Ministry of Education that does not allow us to close schools, but when that time comes.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. It's an important one because obviously there are growth areas of the city that we are, and I think the example that was provided here is Wedgwood, and that's a good example of a school where the enrollment actually is higher than the capacity. So there are a number of portables. What happens there is we work through the ministry processes when they allow us to be able to ask for additional funding for either a new school, if possible, or an addition to the school. And then through our planning department, which does look at, are there other schools in the area that we could, look at the boundaries of those schools and how does that impact certain schools when we have, say, new developments where you're going to see the signs when you go to move into that area that says that you may not attend the specific neighborhood school for those reasons because there's a school that's close by that isn't at full capacity. So those are all the things that we are considering. School closures, it's obviously a difficult process to go through. The pupil accommodation reviews in the process are somewhat dictated by the ministry, but also determined a lot on public input. And so when we are able to go through that process, we would look at different areas, and our secondary program strategy, which is online, does identify the secondary program areas where we would be looking at doing pupil accommodation reviews once we are allowed.
Okay, thank you for that. Trying to get to as many questions as we can. One question of how do we get the government to repay the TDSB for COVID-19 related expenses? I can tell you that trustees, whether it be through their local MPPs, letters to the ministry, have appealed to the government to repay the TDSB for approximately $70 million in COVID-19 related expenses, although my understanding is that was not agreed to. Another question about, were cuts to non-school central staff considered? Yes, I think Stacey has outlined some of those. One person saying their school is losing our VP, which I've always had, and we have not had a decrease in enrollment. Can you explain how this could happen? It really is that, I think it would be a very specific school question that's best addressed to the principal or the superintendent. I'm not sure of the unique circumstances of that school that may have led to that. Just going through, bear with me while we go through some questions and try to get to as many as we can. Can income be generated through renting empty schools to outside agencies, businesses? I'll defer to Craig and or Stacey, but they are. We permit our facilities after school, on weekends, on a routine basis to community organizations and that kind of thing. Anything else to add on that, Craig?
Yeah, I mean, we have the Toronto Lands Corporation leases closed sites to other entities, other private schools or other organizations. We do leases, like our childcare spaces are leased out to childcare operators, and we have similar things where we lease out permanent space. And then, as Ryan kind of answered in his part of the question, was we also, when you do things like permits where a soccer league wants to rent the field for every Wednesday night for the spring or something like that, those are other sources of revenue for the board as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Any unallocated funds available at the ministry that could be released to help alleviate this budget shortfall? My understanding is no, we've received and been, or at least have received indication of all the money that we will be receiving?
Yeah, and again, through staff working with the ministry staff and through our trustees advocating to the province, we have been asking similar questions and looking for assistance for TDSB related to TDSB specific issues. So that advocacy has been happening and we have not received any additional funds.
Okay, thank you for that. Someone asking, can you explain what is a school-based safety monitor? Is that like a security guard? It is a staff member within our secondary schools that would, go through the hallways, develop relationships with students, get to know the students, and really get to know the school, see who's coming and going. It really is a unique position here at the TDSB that is in our secondary schools. Just looking for additional questions as we get close to wrapping up here. Bear with me. Sorry, bear with me if I may. I'm just looking. Is there an update on TDSB aquatic staff? Stacey, my understanding is that at a recent meeting, we did have staff added back into the budget that would likely bring us to a level where programs would not be impacted. Is that fair to say?
Thanks, Ryan. And so staff had been asked how many would be required to bring programming back to original, and the answer is about 6 staff or about $400,000. Trustees are considering this as part of the overall budget. So nothing has been added back at this time, but everybody is aware of what it would take, and it will be considered as part of the overall process and would be approved on the 20th.
Thank you so much. And finally, the one person saying, is the board happy with this proposed budget? I don't think any of us are necessarily happy with it. Pleased that we've been able to reach the goals outlined in the deficit recovery plan. But I think we obviously have for a number of years, and I'll defer to my colleagues, appealed for sustainable, predictable funding. And that doesn't always happen. But generally, I think we're doing the very best under difficult circumstances. Craig or Stacey, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, and again, just to go back to those budget drivers and where we haven't made reductions. So we do believe that we have put options in front of the board that get us to where we need to be with as minimal impact on students and programs as possible.
That is great. Thank you so much. That does bring us to the end of this afternoon's budget town hall. We hope you found this session informative. We tried to get to as many questions from a variety of posters and variety of topics as best we could. We'll be sharing the feedback we received today with all of our trustees and then continue to make budget decisions with that information. Trustees will in the weeks ahead. As a reminder, we will be holding a second budget town hall this evening at 7 p.m. As mentioned, today's session has been recorded and will be posted to the TDSB's budget website. You can visit www.tdsb.on.ca/budget for the latest information. We'll also be hearing budget deputations at the Finance, Budget and Enrollment Committee meeting on June 12th at 4:30. The deadline to register for those delegations for this meeting is Friday, June 9th at 12 p.m. You can visit the budget website for more information. On behalf of Stacey, Craig, and myself, my thanks to Zoya McGroarty and Ronnie Levy for helping us organize this afternoon's event. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you soon. Take care.